The last bias I want to talk about is our technology bias, that because they didn't have our technology as we define it, they didn't have our problems in the past. While we were researching, we read about the process of nixtamilization of corn. And what that is how Native Americans processed corn to eat. And what they would do is they would take the corn and they would soak it in an alkali solution first, usually involving lime water or something like that. And they would soak it there for a few days first. And then they would crack it open and grind it in with a mortar and pestle, and they would eat it. When the European settlers came, they introduced a new process. They said, hey, we have mills, we have these giant stones, we can do a lot of corn a lot faster than that. Here, we're going to do it our way instead. Well, the problem is then a whole bunch of settlers started getting sick. They were eating lots and lots of corn as a staple, but they weren't getting the nutritional benefits of it. And that's what they just assumed, that corn wasn't very nutritious. What they didn't realize is the process of nixtamilization, the way the Native Americans were soaking their corn in this combination of ash and water, actually released nutrients from the corn that weren't accessible otherwise. But the Westerners came in and said, hey, we've got this better idea. We can do it faster. We've got better technology. We'll create more of it. They didn't fully understand the process. Faster, bigger, more technology isn't always better. If they'd kept doing it the way that the Native Americans had been processing the corn, they would have been healthier. Fewer people would have died of these nutritional deficiencies, and they actually would have been healthier overall. They just didn't understand that's what was happening. We see this a lot, especially with native cultures. I mean, Emily, you talked about Incan civilization, and how they didn't even have the wheel, but they accomplished so much.
Right. I'm constantly astounded at how much they were able to accomplish without some of these technologies that we consider so basic, like the wheel or the written language.
When you talked about how they got fish from the coast to the city in less than a day, how did they do that?
They would get fresh caught fish in the ocean on the shore all the way up to their capital city in the mountains within a day. And they could do that because they'd set up weigh stations every 2 to 15 or so kilometers, depending on the roughness of the terrain, where, kind of like the Pony Express in the 1800s, they would have runners go from way station to way station and then pass it off to the next person. So you always had somebody fresh who was doing the deliveries, and then you had time to rest in between any deliveries that needed to be made. They also used that for communication, so they could get information across vast distances really fairly quickly. And of course that was aided by the fact that they had these 14,000 miles of paved roads and highways. It just boggles my mind that they were able to do that. And they didn't even have what we consider essential for a project like that, the wheel.
So were these large amounts they were going from way station to way station, or were they doing relatively small shipments?
They did both. It could be everything from, the emperor needed to get a message from point A to point B, and so it was just a single person going, or they had llama caravans that would take large quantities of items for trade or deliveries from the coast to the highlands.
Well, it's really interesting thinking about how this was being handled in other parts of the world at the same time. Nowhere near that efficiency. Their solution was to catch the fish, pack in a lot of salt, and wait until you had enough to take on this very slow caravan somewhere. It's a very interesting solution to the problem that wasn't addressed in other places.
Well, it's even more than that, because what you have here in a lot of cases is people not truly understanding the technology. The Europeans didn't understand the corn and the technology used for being able to eat that and provide nutrition. And you had the Egyptians, for example, building the pyramids, when you think about it, was a mammoth undertaking. And I would really defy most modern people in our society to come up with a way of building a pyramid without using big, huge machines or cranes or anything else. They wouldn't understand how to do that. The Egyptians came up with very ingenious ways of using materials. They didn't have steel, but they were still able to shape these stones and fit them together and do so on an industrial scale. But at the same time, because people don't always understand technology, they end up basically using it the way they have done things in the past. And you see this over and over again. And particularly, you see that in warfare. Adage is, we're always fighting the last war. Great example is our Civil War. You had the introduction, actually, in the early or late 18th century, of the rifled musket. The Kentucky long rifles, best example of that. It could hit a target anywhere from 300 to 500 yards. The traditional British musket, for example, was only good for about 50 yards, which is why they fired them in mass. But all of a sudden now you had the mass production, and by the time you get to the Civil War, you had mass production of the rifle barrel. So now you can accurately fire out to 300 yards or more. But how do people fight? They still line up, fire in mass. Well, if you're lining up in mass and you're 300 yards apart, guess what? People are going to be able to shoot you. It's no longer a chance. It is probably they're going to shoot you, which is why the Civil War still remains the bloodiest war in our history, because they were still fighting the last war, but with modern technology.
Well, but I think that actually kind of defines all of our history. We are always fighting the same, like we've said, there are no new problems, the same problems we've always dealt with. We were just talking about Cahokia, which was this massive Native American city directly across the river from St. Louis. About 1000 AD, it only had about 1,000 residents, and in less than 3 centuries, it exploded to over 40,000 residents. It was bigger than London. No city, even colonial cities in the U.S., were larger than it until the late 1700s when Philadelphia exploded. It was mammoth. They had waterways. They had extremely advanced suburban areas. And they finally started collapsing in about the 14th century due to bad waterways, because the river became so polluted from having so many people there. If you've been to New York or anywhere else, this is not a new problem. Anytime lots of people get together, you have a lot of pollution. I mean, that's a 40,000 person city that no one noticed or paid attention to. It's a pretty recent discovery, because when the Western European settlers came through and started settling that part of the country, they found remnants of it, but they didn't understand what it was. So they would find arrowheads, they would find other relics, and they would just throw them off into the trash heap, or they'd incorporate them into whatever they were building, because they didn't understand the significance of it. And how much could we have learned about living on the frontier and even now, what can we learn about how they solved their water issues and how they grew and collapsed by studying this ancient city.
But also goes back to one reason why people didn't pay attention to this is because each person was like working on their farm, finding these little things, and hey, this is more of a hassle. I've got to worry about getting my crop in and getting it raised and getting harvest and whatnot. And there's no one looking at the big picture.
We still do that, though. We're still working so hard to clean up pollution in our cities and deal with whatever our current problem is in our business. We don't stop to look at what the history is.
And a good example of that here locally in Spokane is you have the Columbia River in this area. You can't clean up the Columbia River unless you go all the way up into Canada. But then that becomes international. And they have a treaty that they've had in place for decades, and now they have to renegotiate it. And one of the big issues is, how do you handle the pollution, which is a problem in the United States, but originates in Canada. And then you add fishing rights and everything else to that, and it's a complex problem which requires understanding everybody's concerns and how it all affects each person.
But it's a complex problem, but it's not a new problem. We talk about pollution as if we are, we are producing high volumes of it right now, but the idea of polluted waterways and urban safety is not a new concept. We've dealt with it over and over in history.
1900 New York City.
Exactly.
They had a pollution problem too.
Oh, they did. So these are some of the principal biases to think about as we're going through and telling these stories, is that sometimes we don't recognize the history of business. It's hidden because we're biased based off of social structure or how we think businesses were owned or run, like with Martha Ballard. Or sometimes we make assumptions about the technology, that they didn't have technology as advanced as ours, we think, so they didn't possibly deal with our problems. That,
like the Incans.
As if history is this progressive continuum that never moves back, never reverts. And sometimes it's just because we misunderstand the culture they existed in, and we think that it had to have been widespread or prominent in order to actually have been a solution or to have mattered. So thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.